It's said that if you were taking a violin lesson from Ivan Galamian and he didn't mention something you were supposed to work on, you should just take that as a compliment. He was an excellent teacher, but an exacting one. He taught Itzhak Perlman, Pinchas Zuckerman, and Joshua Bell, some of the best violinists in the world over 2 or 3 generations. He didn't have a reputation for yelling or physical abuse or otherwise making his students cry, all of which were pretty common practice up to just a couple of decades ago. But he also didn't give compliments. There's an old story of Shinichi Suzuki, the violin teacher and founder of the Suzuki method, giving a lesson in front of a bunch of other teachers back in the 60s. The child played, and he played quite badly, and when the piece was over, Suzuki looked at him kindly, smiled, and said, "Good, you played," and got on with the lesson. After the lesson was over, the other teachers who had been raised in a punitive environment said, "Why did you tell him it was good? He played so badly." And Suzuki said, "Well, other children have been so nervous that they simply haven't played at all, but he got up and played, even though he was nervous. He could have not played, but he played, and that was good." Finding something specific and truthful and positive to say laid the groundwork for the teaching Suzuki needed to accomplish in that lesson. For Suzuki, the compliment is the first component of a good lesson. It establishes what is going right. It helps both the teacher and the student to determine which work has been successful and which skills still need attention. Specific, truthful praise. Whenever I'm teaching a violin lesson, the first thing out of my mouth after a child has played their piece is to say something positive, but very specific and truthful. "Wow, your tone was so big. Oh, I can tell you have really been working on your posture. Your bow was so straight. You were so careful with your eyes." Throughout my years of teacher training, we were admonished to never simply say, "Good job," or "Well done." Any statement like that, which could be taken generally and dismissed, was something we were always told to follow up with a specific observation. If a comment isn't specific and truthful, it's not useful. In his Sermon on the Plain, which is Luke's version of Matthew's much longer Sermon on the Mount, Jesus gets right to the point. He uses very specific language to get right to the heart of lifting up those who need a word of encouragement and challenging those of us who need to be reminded that we have a lot to offer. Instead of simply saying, "Y'all are blessed," he specifically calls out those of us who need to be lifted up, the poor, the hungry, and the grieving, and specifically challenges those of us who have the spiritual and material resources to help those who are hurting. He is comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. Of course, we have a human instinct to sort ourselves into boxes, and it's tempting to figure out where we fit in. We've got a tendency to want to make sure we're on the right side. For those of us in this first world context, we'll find we slot in much more frequently among the woes than the blessings. But many of us will find we've got a genuine place in both of Jesus's lists. Jesus is plainly speaking the specific truth to each of us. We have a human instinct to want to believe we are in control. It's why the prosperity gospel is such a durable ideology. If I pray hard enough, God will bless me, right? We also see it in a more generalized spirituality. If I think good thoughts, good things will come to me. And we see it in our westernized, simplified conception of the Hindu concept of karma, which is the idea that sowing good seeds will bear good fruit. But all of these ideas fail to recognize the capriciousness of the world, that even the best seeds will fail to thrive without the right opportunity and environment, that a natural disaster could sweep away or destroy even the most carefully cultivated seedlings. We instinctively equate hardship with personal failing. We want so badly to believe we can control our lives that we're apt to blame ourselves when something bad happens to us, or we blame other people when bad things happen to them. In our desire to prevent a bad thing, we look for someone to blame and look for reasons why that bad thing won't happen to us. This instinct has the effect of separating us from each other. And often, that blame fails to recognize that sometimes bad things just happen because it turns out all of life is precarious. Jesus' words of encouragement for those who are experiencing hardship are a balm in the face of so much adversity. Jesus sees those whom society tries to erase, the poor, the hungry, and the grieving. Jesus elevates their suffering for everyone in the crowd, lifting them up and proclaiming that their hardship is not their fault, that they are not alone, and giving them a promise that they will stand in the light of God. And he calls out those who have much, the rich, those whose bellies are full, those who are laughing now. Do not think you are better than others just because your life is easy now. Do not forget that you are always just one event from those you would wish to forget. Remember your connection to those who are poor, who are hungry, who grieve, because you are not as far from them as you think you are. Perhaps the hardest set is the one about other people's opinions about you. We all want to be spoken well of, but what about those of us who go out on a limb? What about those who stand up for what's right, who are willing to put their jobs and reputations on the line to make the world a better place? You can't work for a more just system if your compass is only based on what other people think about you. Blessed are those, Jesus says, who are willing to lay it all on the line to make the world a better place. In a society that seeks to divide us and pit us against each other, Jesus reminds us that we are all connected. We all have each experienced different parts of these lists, and if we haven't already, we will. Good thoughts cannot protect us from tragedy. It's community that provides the buffer for life's challenges. Have you ever laughed at a funeral because you shared a funny memory of the person you were mourning? Have you ever cried at a wedding because you remembered someone who had died? Have you ever received generosity from someone who was incredibly poor, or given generously even when you didn't have much yourself? In this sermon, Jesus is showing us that for most of us, we don't solely occupy one category. Just as we are simultaneously saint and sinner, we celebrate even when we mourn, and we are called to share generously even when we feel like we don't have much. We find community and our humanity in the intersection between blessings and woes. Frederick Buechner wrote, "The place God calls you to is the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet." When we recognize the gifts we do have and see Jesus' woes as a challenge to us to use the gifts we have to work for a world that feeds the hungry, comforts the mourning, and lifts up the poor and the oppressed, we find our own calling rooted in our baptismal identity. Jesus doesn't just #bless us. Jesus sends us out to be a blessing. Amen.